I kept the manifests. That was my whole office for 31 years. Other men in our delegation argued law or traded favors or learned to read the Oloran the way you learn weather. I kept the manifests. I logged tonnage and lien and lane right. I stamped what crossed and what was held, and I filed every page in the order the Combine taught us to file it, because the Combine owned the order, and for 600 years the order said that we were freight. You have to understand what the word meant to them before you can understand what happened in that hall. The Oloran did not measure a people by their fleets or their gods or the books they wrote. They measured a people by what could be moved and by who held the right to move it. A carrier was a power. A carrier owned lanes, owned liens, owned the registry stamps that said a thing might pass. And cargo was the rest. Cargo was anything that was carried. They had filed us as cargo the day they first found our ships limping out past the cold edge of our own system, and they had kept us filed that way ever since, the way a clerk keeps a number once it is written, because rewriting a number is work, and the Oloran did not do unnecessary work. I was 44 years in service before I sat in the exchange hall of the carriage combine of the Oloran Reach, and I want to set the room down plainly, because the room was the argument. It was built like a great inverted bowl, a hall of pale stone and brushed metal, tier on tier of curved seating folding down toward a low floor, and over all of it a dome of clear glass wide as a small sea. Through that glass the daylight came in hard and clean, a sky the color of washed steel, and the light pooled on the floor where the speakers stood and left the tiers above in a cool blue shadow. Holographic ledgers glowed along the walls in the Oloran script, long columns of carriage and lien scrolling slow, and the whole place hummed with the low sound of a body that had never once doubted it was the heaviest thing in the room. There were perhaps 400 of them seated that day. The Oloran are not a tall people. They sit folded, their reading membranes drawn back along the sides of their skulls like a man pushing his sleeves up, and when they are content the membranes lie flat and gray. When they are uneasy, the membranes lift. I had learned to watch for that over the years. It was the only honest thing about them. A first carrier could lie with his voice and lie with his ledger, but the membrane lifted on its own. We were 3 at the floor. The envoy, Sierra-eyed one who would speak if speaking were called for, a junior aide named Holt who carried nothing and saw everything, and me with the case. The case held the manifest. Not the manifest the Combine kept of us, the other one, the true one. I had been carrying some version of it in some form my whole career, and so had the man before me and the woman before him, back, and none of us had ever set it on a table. That was the discipline of the thing. You did not show the manifest. You kept it. You added to it. You waited. The session opened the way their sessions always opened, with the registry prime reading the standing of the floor, who held what, who owed what, which liens had come due since last convening. It was a long reading and a deliberate one, because the reading itself was a kind of throne. To hear your holdings read aloud before 400 carriers was to be reminded, in their grammar, of exactly how much of the galaxy answered to you. The Sethran holdings were read. The Combine's own central holdings were read, vast past counting. And in the lower registry, near the bottom where the ledger keeps its smallest entries, our line was read. Sol origin haulage stock, the registry prime said, in that flat carrying tone they use for inventory. Carriage tier 3rd class, lien held by the Combine general account, no outstanding amendment. No outstanding amendment. I logged it, old habit, I logged everything. Then the first carrier rose, and I knew the day had a shape to it. His name was Vol Sethic, and he was as old as the Reach allowed a carrier to grow, which is very old, and his membrane was flat and gray and certain. He had carried freight across 900 lanes before I was born. He did not raise his voice. The Oloran great ones never raise the voice. The room comes to them. He spoke of debt. He spoke of the Sethran, who held a long lien against the Combine's central account, a lien that had come due, and of the Combine's need to settle it in a manner that cost the Combine nothing it valued. And he spoke, In the gentle way a man speaks of selling a tool he has stopped using of us. The Saul haulage stock has been carried at a loss for 2 centuries, he said. It produces little. It is held out of habit, not value. The Sethran will take the lien against it in settlement. We will transfer the registry of the Saul stock, its carriage, its lanes of approach, its lien to the Sethran account, and the debt is closed. He let that settle. The membranes along the tiers stayed flat. To them it was bookkeeping. They were closing a debt by handing over a thing they had stopped looking at, and the thing happened to be us, our worlds, our ships, our names, the right to move us and the right to be moved by no one else. They would sell the registry of humanity the way a man sells a wagon he no longer drives. I felt Holt go still beside me. I felt Sierra Idwan's breath change very slightly. I did not move. My job was the case, and the case was not opened yet. "Is there objection from the floor?" the registry prime asked, which was a formality. There is never objection from the floor when the first carrier has spoken. The Aloran do not argue with weight. "The Saul delegation may speak," Sethek said, and there was something almost kind in it, the way you let a thing make its noise before you put it away. Briefly. Sierra Idwan looked at me. We had agreed the order of it long before in a small room with no glass, the way you agree the order of a thing you hope you will never have to do. She did not rise. That was the first surprise to them, I think, though their membranes did not yet lift. The delegation that is about to be sold rises. It pleads, or it threatens, or it weeps, and the weight in the room presses it down, and that is the ceremony. She stayed seated. She inclined her head toward me. I opened the case. I have thought since about how small a sound it was. A latch. In a hall that size under that dome, a latch is nothing. But I have learned that the moments that turn are almost never loud. The loud moments are the ones that were always going to happen. It is the quiet ones, the latch, the page set down, the stamp, that change a thing that was already decided. I took out the manifest. It is not a grand object. We had made it deliberately to look like nothing, a plain bound ledger, dark cover, no seal. The kind of thing a clerk carries. I had carried grander-looking decoys for years, to be searched and dismissed. This was the real one, and it looked like the least important thing in the room, and that too was the discipline. I rose and I crossed the lit floor, and I set it on the long table before the registry prime, and I said 2 things. I said, before the transfer is sealed, the registry must be reconciled. And I said, the lanes are already filed. Then I closed the case, and I sat back down. You will want me to tell you that the hall erupted. It did not. The Aloran do not erupt. Their power is in not erupting. What happened was slower, and to one who had learned to watch the membranes, far worse for them. The registry prime, out of nothing more than procedure, for no transfer could be sealed against an unreconciled registry, that was their own law, older than any of us, opened my ledger to reconcile it against theirs. He expected, I am sure, a few small claims, a clerk's last grasp, the sort of thing you note and overrule. He expected to spend a moment being thorough, and then to close the debt. He read the first page. His membrane did not move. He read the second. It lifted a little at the left. The thing about a reconciliation is that it is not an argument. It is a check. You hold one record against another and you see where they disagree, and the law does not care who is louder. It cares which entry is older, which stamp is prior, which lien was filed first. The Aloran had built their whole order on that principle, because it favored them. They were always first. They had always filed first. The prior stamp was always theirs. It had never once occurred to them to wonder what would happen if it wasn't. Let me tell you what was in the ledger, because that is the whole of it, and there is no spectacle to it, which is exactly why it worked. For 600 years we had been freight. We had accepted that. We had sat at the bottom of the registry and produced little and cost them little notice. And in those 600 years, lane by lane, stamp by stamp, under names that were not obviously ours, shell carriers, neutral haulage cooperatives, registry trusts filed in a dozen small jurisdictions the Combine never bothered to read, we had filed. We had filed for the approach lanes to our own system, which the Combine had never thought to register because who registers an approach to cargo? We had filed for the carriage rights along the corridors that ran past our worlds. We had filed liens, small ones, patient ones, paid in full and on time, decade after decade, against the very lanes the Combine now proposed to sell, until the prior stamp on those lanes, the oldest reconciled claim, the one the law would honor first, was ours. We had not stolen anything. That is what they could never afterward say. Every stamp was lawful. Every filing was made in the open registry, in their own halls, by their own rules, paid for in their own currency of tonnage and time. They had simply never read the bottom of the ledger, because the bottom of the ledger was freight, and freight does not file. The registry prime read on. Pages turned. The hum of the hall had thinned to almost nothing, and in that thinning I could hear the small, dry sound of the membranes lifting along the lower tiers, the carriers nearest the floor who could see the prime's posture and had begun, without yet knowing why, to be afraid. "First carrier," the registry prime said at last. His voice was careful. "The reconciliation does not close." "Then overrule it," Sethek said. He had not yet understood. Why would he? In 600 years no reconciliation had ever failed to close in his favor. "I cannot overrule it." The prime set one membrane flat against the ledger, the Oloran gesture for a fact that cannot be moved. "The Sol stock holds prior stamp on the lanes named in the transfer, the approach lanes to settlement of the debt, the corridor liens, the carriage rights along 9 of the 11 lanes in the instrument." He paused. "The Combine cannot transfer to the Sethran a registry the Combine does not hold." I want to be honest about what I felt then, because it was not triumph. I had kept the manifests for 31 years, and I had always known this day might come, and I had always dreaded the silence of it more than I had ever hoped for the win. There is no joy in watching a thing realize it has been wrong for 600 years. There is only the weight of it. Sethek rose fully then. His membrane had finally lifted, both sides high, the posture they almost never show in a public hall, the posture of a carrier who has lost his footing. "There is some error," he said, "some forgery. Bring the Combine's own ledger." They brought it. It took 4 of them to carry the central registry stone to the floor, and the prime reconciled my plain dark book against their great record before the whole hall, line by line, lane by lane, with the law watching, and at every line where they disagreed the prior stamp was ours. Not by trick, by date. We had simply filed first and waited and paid and said nothing, for longer than any of them had been alive. It is a strange thing to watch a room of 400 carriers understand, all at once and without a single shout, that the thing they had been moving was not cargo, that the freight at the bottom of their ledger had spent 6 centuries quietly becoming the carrier of the very lanes they sat upon, that when they reached to sell us, they had reached for a wagon and found their own hand already filed under another name. Sethek looked at me, not at the envoy, at me, the clerk, the man with the case, because he had understood by then who keeps the manifests, and that the manifest is the only weapon in a hall that lives by the ledger. "What is it you want?" he said. It was not a question the way you ask a question. It was the question of a man who has just learned the floor is not where he thought it was. Sira Idwan rose then, because this was the part that was hers, and she said one sentence, and it was the only thing any of us said that day longer than a line, and even it was short. "We want the registry read correctly," she said, "nothing more." That was all. We did not demand the lanes. We held the lanes. Demanding them would have been theater, and theater was the Oloran's art, not ours. We did not call them to account for 600 years of the lower registry. We did not ask for the debt, or for tribute, or for the Sethran's lien, or for anything that a victor takes. We asked only that the record be read correctly, because we had not built the manifest to take the galaxy from them. We had built it so that they could never again pick us up and set us down like freight, and the only thing required for that was the truth, read aloud in their own hall, under their own law. And here is the thing I have never been able to make people back home fully understand. The thing that was the whole of the win. Through the glass dome in the hard, clean daylight, the lanes were already ours. Not metaphorically. The carriers were there. You could see them. High in the steel-colored sky beyond the glass, where the combine's own approach corridor ran past the exchange world, hung the haulage. Not warships we had not come to threaten, and the niche of the threat was not ours. Carriers. Long, patient, kilometer-scale freight haulers. The most ordinary ships in the galaxy. Hanging in formation along the lane the Combine had just tried to sell. Because they were the registered carriers of that lane, and they had every lawful right to be there. And there were a great many of them. And they had been moving that corridor for years while the Combine read its grand holdings aloud and never once looked down at who was actually doing the carrying. That was when the membranes lifted along the whole haul at once. Not at a fleet. The Aloran had seen fleets. At freighters. At the plainest ships in creation, sitting lawfully in a lane the Combine had believed it owned, proving with their dull, patient presence that the bottom of the ledger had quietly become the top. Sethek turned from me to the dome. He looked a long moment at the carriers hanging in the daylight. And then he did the thing I had crossed half a galaxy hopping he would have the sense to do, because the alternative was so much worse for everyone. And he was, whatever else, a carrier, and a carrier knows when a lien has come due. "Recall the order," he said. He said it quietly, the way he said everything, but it carried, because the hall had gone so still that a quiet word filled it. The registry prime did not move. The Sethran observers in their high tier did not move. 400 membranes stood lifted in the cool blue shadow, and the daylight pooled on the empty floor where I had set the ledger. "Recall the order," Sethek said again, and this time there was something under it I had not heard from an Aloran Great One in 31 years, and I did not have a word for it until later, on the long way home, when I finally let myself name it. It was not fear exactly. It was the sound a man makes when the ground he has stood on his whole life turns out to have been a floor, and the floor turns out to have belonged to someone else, and that someone has been holding it up, uncomplaining, the entire time. "These lanes were never ours," he said. "Strike the transfer, reconcile the registry, read it correctly." And they did. That is the part that matters and the part that no one tells well because there is no spectacle in it. They struck the transfer. They reconciled the registry, lane by lane, before the whole hall, and where the prior stamp was ours they wrote our name correctly in the open ledger where it had always lawfully belonged. It took the rest of that day and most of the next. I logged every line. Old habit. We did not become their masters. We did not want to be. A people that has spent 600 years being moved learns, better than any other, exactly what it costs to move someone and exactly how little it is worth. We took the lanes that were lawfully ours, and we left the rest, and we let the Combine settle its own debt with the Sethran out of holdings that were actually theirs, which it turned out it had in plenty, once it stopped trying to pay with us. But the registry was read correctly. After that, you could not file a Sol Origin ship as freight. You could not hold a lien against a human world out of habit. The bottom of the ledger had a name on it now in their own hand, and the law they had built to favor themselves favored the name that filed first and waited, and we had filed first, and we had waited a very long time. I have wondered since whether they hate us for it. I do not think they do in the way you might expect. The Aloran are a mercantile people, and to a mercantile people there is a grudging dignity in a lien well kept. What they cannot forgive, I think, is not that we beat them. It is that we beat them with their own ledger, in their own hall, by their own oldest rule, without raising a voice, and that the weapon we did it with was patience and bookkeeping, and the discipline never to show the manifest until it could not be overruled. Sethek spoke to me once more at the end, when the reconciliation was finished and the case was closed and the daylight through the dome had gone long and low. He came down to the floor, which a first carrier does not do, and his membranes were flat again, gray and certain. A carrier's composure recovered, and he looked at the plain, dark ledger in my hands. "How long?" he said. I knew what he meant. How long had we been filing? How long had the bottom of his ledger been quietly becoming its top, while he read his grand holdings aloud and never looked down? 600 years, I said, give or take. We started the day you filed us as freight. He was quiet a moment. Then he said the only thing he ever said to me that I have carried home and kept, the way I keep the manifests. "You let us call you cargo," he said, "for 600 years. "We did," I said. "Why?" And I told him the truth, because there was no longer any reason not to, and because it was the whole of it, and because a man who has just learned the floor was never his is owed at least the truth about who held it up. Because a thing that is called cargo, I said, is a thing nobody watches. Then I closed the case and we went home up the lanes that were ours, the plainest ships in creation, moving the corridor we had registered first and held longest, past worlds that had stopped that day, being something that could be picked up and set down. I kept the manifest. I added the reconciliation to it, every line in the order they taught us to file it. And I filed it at the bottom where the smallest entries go, where nobody watches. That is where we keep the important things.